Hi,
Hello and Happy New Year.
and to you, and to you,
Nice to see you again.
and you. How have you been?
Good. Just, busy with work.
Yeah,
Other than that, I have been able to catch up on all of the stuff you've posted lately, so that's a good thing.
yeah, yeah. There's a new one out right now, Ruth and Bad. I haven't listened to it yet, though.
hmm
Yeah.
I got a few answers. I remember I wanted to ask you if you ride horses, so that one has been cleared up. And I have quite a passion for them.
All right. Do you have a horse? Do you own one?
No,
No.
no, don't own a horse. I used to drive my grandparents crazy about getting one because they had cows but no horses, and I
No
just
horses.
couldn't understand why.
Well, there's so much work. There's so much work, and you have to exercise them. You have to ride them a lot, to make it worthwhile.
Well, on our village side, they only use horse for work labor, not for riding.
Is that right?
Yes, and as far as my grandparents were concerned, if they don't give milk, then they're not worth having. And I
Right.
just couldn't understand that rationale. It made no sense to me.
Well, of course, if they'd been I don't know, from the Hunnic Empire or Scythians or Mongols, then the mares would be giving milk. So
I don't think Romanians would consume it though.
I think that there's still milked in Mongolia, as far as I know.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
they use the milk including for chai.
yeah,
I did get to ride a few times, but I'm no big rider. I'd love to though. I really, really love them.
yeah, yeah. It's a lot of fun to ride a horse. Yeah.
And I got to interact a little with Aiden, AB, Canavan.
AP?
We got a we got to chat a little bit about Discovery and what makes it so terrible. That was fun.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, yeah. We just finished watching the last episode, so we had a conversation on it on Sunday.
The last episode of season 3.
Yeah. I'm kind of hoping it's the last episode ever of Discovery. So
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things that are bad with it.
yeah, and it's so unfortunate because the universe is has so much potential, and it's such a originally it was such a positive vision of humanity, and it's just been completely messed up. Oh well.
Well, I fear I might have made a bad impression though. I commented on Discovery being heavily politicized, among other things.
Hmm.
It's one of the things that makes it bad. And I said that the main character being female black with a male name seems to be a political statement more than anything. And I think he believed I was complaining about Michael being black, so that might
Right.
not come across as positive.
Yeah. No, it's hard to tell. I mean, the original Star Trek definitely had a strong um, political position. Um, the new the new version seems to be just so much clumsier. It's as if um, people are uh, put into the put into the series um, as kind of signposts, and so they're not explored, and their life experience is not explored. They're simply um, kind of token presence, repeated over and over again, and it's really unfortunate. Because there's nothing wrong with having a as diverse a cast as you can possibly have. Um, it's just it's a difficult subject matter because it's volatile. It's a bit of a minefield. Um, it all comes down to every character needs to be fully understood and treated with respect. And if somebody is simply placed there as in a token presence, that's actually an absence of respect. It's You know, it's as if they're just, yeah, they're just sort of cookie cutout characters. Um, the series for me just felt desperate. The writing felt desperate all the way through. Um, and I mean, there's a lot of reasons behind that. I suspect, you know, there's a lot of pressure because it's not done well, and um, Netflix has been pretty, you know, pretty pissed off with it, and so it's been losing money. And of course, Star Trek has never really been something that lost money, um, apart from the original series. So it's just, yeah, you know, it begs the question of why is this thing not actually appealing to an audience? And you know, both Discovery and Picard are sort of falling into the same thing. They seem to be missing the mark massively. And to me and to AP, you know, it comes down to story. It comes down to actually creating a story that's interesting and evocative, uh, and gives the actors enough leeway to actually, you know, build into their characters and grow into their characters. And this seems to be every technological invention in the new Discovery is a means is a structural means. It's a means by which to move characters from one place to another really quickly. So basically what's happening is it's just this cavalcade of action sequences that are one tumbling after another because the ship can go anywhere and, you know, instantly. Characters can beam anywhere instantly, even without even voicing where they want to go. They just sort of show up. The transporter system it's so nonsensical. It's just, and you can see it's there for structural purposes and plotting purposes, to move characters. And so characters don't get room. They don't get time. There's no instances of, you know, a ship flying across, you know, 3 sectors of space or whatever parsecs of space, to get somewhere. So there's no tension because, you know, the ship just, you know, it flips around and shows up. So it's like they created these things to propel the plot along, without understanding that sometimes you actually need, to slow things down and to make it difficult to get from one place to another, because that's where character development comes in, and that's where story and tension and everything else comes in. So it's been, yeah, it's just been really excruciating to watch. And I know AP has been pretty constrained, because when he and I talk on Sundays, it's a whole different beast. We just sort of, yeah, we're the level of sarcasm and derision is pretty high. So
I can imagine. And it's probably quite fun.
yeah, but frustrating too, because I'd like it to be good, you know, and it's not. So
Well, it almost feels as if you have, I want this scene and this scene and this scene, and now let's just connect the plots with the characters. It's one like those drawings with numbers.
yeah, 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 absolutely.
And the characters somehow seem fake, like
Oh,
forced,
yeah,
imposed.
everything's forced. That's the desperation. Everything is forced. These last few episodes, I mean, actually this last season, it's like every third scene has characters in tears, you know, welling of the eyes, and it's just melodramatic. It's just forced. It's pushed and pushed. Um, and yet, you know, I'm one of the first people who sort of falls into empathy when I watch film and television. So, you know, I can get tears in my eyes in any scene. And yet I'm completely indifferent to watching this because it's so forced, it's so fake. Um, the emotional context is just, it's not believable. And you can see the actors struggling with it. You know, the character who plays Burnham, I mean, she struggles with it all the time because everything is forced on, you know, forced on that character. Which then makes you think, well, no, you wouldn't want that as a captain at all. Just like you wouldn't want Tilly as a first officer.
Definitely.
You know, she started the series as an ensign, for crying out loud. So, you know, to suddenly be a first officer within 3 years is just absurd.
That was part of my argument actually. The politics, not so much the politics, but maybe like the life philosophy that is lately happening in the American West, so to say, the North American continent. This concept that you don't need to be capable, you don't need to be fit for your job, you just have to dream about it and reach out for your dream, and people owe it to you to make your dream come true, and you just have to feel everything, and everything's gonna be fine, and you're just a precious human being, and everything can happen. So that seems nonsensical, non-realistic, especially
Yeah,
not in the military.
yeah, and especially, yeah. I mean, the notion of a military structure has been out the window since the first episode of the series. Um, yeah, it's I don't know if it's generational, but it's that sense of um, I just had a sense that you had this entire crew on this ship, none of whom, had the right to be there because, literally had no life experience. And it's as if what we're seeing is something of the writing room. And I'm not going to dump all over the writers, but I just had a sense that, you look at the original series and two of the primary showrunners, Gene Roddenberry and Gene L. Kuhn, were both military veterans. So they had lived and experienced a lot in their lives by the time they got to this thing, by the time they got to Star Trek. And it shows in the maturity of the storylines. I don't see that in Discovery. I don't see that maturity at all. And you're right. It's as if everybody is given the privilege of taking shortcuts to their goals without actually having to work for it. It's just handed to them, and it is a very very strange and bewildering kind of uh, vision of the universe. It's like the Abram movies. You had a very young Kirk and a very young Spock and etc. who crashed their starship into the city of San Francisco. Um, and then 10 minutes later, they're given a new ship. It's like, hand the car keys over to, daddy's got the next car. So hand the keys over and we're going to go joyriding again. You're thinking that's not how it works. You don't hand a ship to somebody who loses a ship. That's one of sort of the unwritten laws of the military naval history is that if you've lost a ship, you're never given another one, ever. And yet that's just not there. It's just not present, in this mindset. It's very strange.
It's just not believable.
No, no.
All right, let's get to actually not Gardens of the Moon. This is a crop question, but it's from Tall the Hounds.
Oh,
I
okay.
I got battered over this quote. I got called a Nazi, and I was told that I am supporting eugenics for quoting you on this one.
All right.
And it turned into a big scandal, and I had to turn off the comments. So
Wow.
it was a pretty big scandal. I think what, October, November, something like that. There's a scene in Tall the Hounds where Carter returns to Darujistan and he talks to Krupp, and he's sort of embarrassed by the fact that he's now Cutter, he's not Crocus anymore. And he tells
Ah,
him that,
Cutter.
I'm not the same person anymore. And Krupp tells him that that's okay, because there is no such thing as real equality. We are not equal to our own selves in different stages of our lives. How could we be equal to other people? And that's such a beautiful quote, and it has so much meaning and significance, but so many people took it the wrong way. And I
How
was,
did they take it?
I suppose in the sense that I'm arguing that some people are superior to others, that some races are better than others, that I'm suggesting that equality is something of rights and not of being equal to oneself or to I mean, if we are all unique, we cannot be equal, we can only be different. Equality of rights is one thing, and equality of being, to say so, is a different thing. I think that's how they saw it, and the accusations of Nazi just poured.
Really?
The moderators received requests to get me out of the moderating team. It was pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, it is a volatile issue because when we talk about equality, we're talking about equality before the law. So it's about the social construct that and the social fabric and structure, which is a very different thing from, sort of the Harrison Bergeron notion of, physical or emotional or mental or whatever kinds of equalities, which sounds nice in principle, but is not borne out. I mean, there are. I mean, it's just how it is. We're not. I've had to wear glasses since I was probably about 10 years old. My brother didn't have to wear glasses until his 50s. So our eyes were not equal. Mine sucked. And
Probably
that's
because you
just how
read
it is.
more.
Hmm?
Probably because you read more.
Yeah, but no, actually, because I think I got the glasses before I really started reading anything. It's genetic. It's I guess I got more from my mother's side in that respect than my father's. And my brother was the opposite. He was older than me, so then you're looking at the biology of my mother was in her 40s when she had me. So my brother's taller than I am. It's all kinds of things that play into how we um, how we turn out. And of course, the issue is always nature versus nurture, and those things are always going to play a role. And I think what the point of Krupp's statement is basically um, that each of us dwells within our own universe of consciousness, and it's um, exclusive. We don't share it with anyone else, and we can build up visions of ourselves that we then attempt to and seek to match in our actions and in our beliefs and in the things we say. And but we're not perfect, and we're flawed, and so we often don't reach those goals. Um, and of course, what Crocus is experiencing, what Cutter is experiencing, is a crisis. It's a crisis of identity, and that's what he is battling with. And in that novel, Toll the Hounds, he's being um, not consciously but subconsciously pulled back to who he used to be, because he is revisiting his infatuation with um, Chalice. And so he's being pulled in these two different directions, and so he's having trouble finding his balance, finding his feet. And I'd have to look at the full quote because I don't have it in front of me, in terms of what Krupp says. So I can't comment specifically on the full context of what Krupp is saying, but I would think he's attempting to ease the crisis in Cutter, uh, basically saying go easy on yourself, because none of us are perfect. None of us are equal even to our own expectations. So.
He he pretty much said what you said. The
Oh yeah, okay, good. At least I'm consistent. All right.
that's the same thing, that while the concept of perfect equality is beautiful, it's actually not real. He actually began with that.
Mm, mm.
So you said the same thing.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where every culture and every society, it it seeks to define itself And part of its self-definition lies in its code of laws, and it's how, you know, how it self-defines its purpose for being. And if one of those codes is promulgating and seeking to enforce equality before the law, then that is a goal to be reached for. But I think anybody, you know, who's at all aware of what's going on in the world at any time and within our societies, we can see that justice is not blind. We can see that we're not equal before the law, and that if you're rich enough, you can actually circumvent a lot of the law. Um, and that not only that, but for all of the um, for all of the good thoughts behind equality before the law, once you've imposed fines as opposed to any other kind of punishment, you are actually punishing the poor much more than you are punishing the wealthy. So somebody in a beater car who gets a $100 speeding ticket may not be able to actually insure that car or buy gas for that car. And basically that level of punishment is so much higher for compared to somebody who gets a speeding ticket who's earning $300,000 a year. He pays that $100 with, you know, without batting an eye, and goes back to driving. And so, you know, equality before the law actually is it's not borne out by reality. And, you know, the poor are punished, and we're continually punished. Um, and as a culture, we continually punish the poor. So yeah, but cultures will have ideals to strive towards, and that is, you know, that's part of the struggle. That's the ongoing struggle, and it's laudable. It's just sometimes the question is, you know, how do you get there? And I can't remember what the question was in this particular instance, so I'm just sort of rambling now. So let's get back to subjects.
We all love to hear you rambling, so that's okay. And that's actually a concept I often think about, the difference between law and justice, because they're not the same, not always.
No, no, no. A lot of what law relates to is social control. Um, and, you know, cultures have always had that. You don't have to actually codify the law. I mean, it can be, you know, if you're looking at a hunter-gatherer culture, it's unwritten, but it's certainly there, and it can be extremely strict. Um, and then the mechanisms of punishment, there will be sort of tiers to it. So, you know, if your behavior does not alter, you know, with those minor tiers of just being, you know, told off or talked to or whatever, or pointed in the right direction, then they start to escalate. And you know, the final punishment for misbehavior in a hunter-gatherer group is banishment. And banishment generally was almost a death sentence, and not because the person couldn't go off and find another band. It's that, although that was part of an issue, but it had to do with the mindset of a person within that culture when taken away or pushed out of that culture. I mean, there's instances of people just curling up and dying. So it's almost as if they will themselves to death by having lost that the universe that they once knew, and being pushed out into something else and something different. So it can be pretty harsh. Um, and control and the status quo are powerful forces in human culture. And that runs across, I think, all of the human condition. It doesn't matter where we're from. Those are powerful forces.
Well, more powerful in some cultures than others, I'd say.
Yes, yes.
I've seen it happen, you know, my husband being Indian, I've seen the power of social pressure on on Indian people as opposed to us here in Europe. we are west to them but east to you, so it's confusing. I was going to say the west, but
Yeah. No, and it's I mean, a lot of what sort of Western quasi-European, neo-European culture is, in terms of anthropological terms, it's here in North America, anyways. It's an exploded nuclear family. It's a non-existent nuclear family. Um, it's been basically dismantled, and and so family does not have that element of social control to the extent that it exists in other cultures, which are very much family oriented in terms of an extended family. And those are immense pressures, and um, not easy to for an individual to actually fight against, and to um, hold their own, hold their ground in terms of their own personal decision making. Those kind of pressures are huge. And here in the West, we often don't feel it because we've got this dismantled family structure where the grandparents leave, or we leave, or nobody's living all under the same roof, the way that many cultures view family and obligations in terms of to grandparents, etc. Um, we've just sort of artificially created buildings in which to store all our old people. It's a very strange structure here, or rather almost non-structure. um, and so there is that sense, I guess, of a little bit more liberty, in terms of individual behavior here in the West, if you want to call it the West. um, and that does not exist everywhere. In fact, it's probably a bit of a minority. I think a lot of cultures are much more family oriented and family bound, for good and for ill.
I think we are experiencing a unique phenomenon here. I mean, the post-communist countries, because after the fall of the communism, there was this general sense of liberation, including a social sense, not just political.
Oh
And
yeah.
along with it, a lot of the old values were thrown out of the window, including the family dynamics. And if you add to that the fact that the elders refuse to leave their villages while the youth has moved to the cities where there are more opportunities, the elders just live alone and we are here and they're just dying on their own.
Yeah. Yeah. um, I think a population that is has been repressed for such, for generations, um, to have that suddenly collapse all around the culture. Yeah, definitely the younger generation is the first one that's going to spall off and take off as quickly as possible, just to get out from under that sort of systemic pressure, that once existed and was uh, promulgated by the powers that be as well. So the state structure actually reinforced the strictures on individual liberty, and so once that's gone, yeah, the young are the ones who are going to be fired up and they're going to head off. And yeah, I mean, I think that's been borne out throughout history, which is quite often why universities are the targets of choice in terms of oppressing the culture. If a government needs to oppress its people, it goes after the universities, and quite often it goes after the teachers and the professors, and throws them in jail. Yeah, yeah,
Well, we know what communism did.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. I think I've
Yeah, I
asked.
mean, but at the same time, here in the West, the opposite of communism, um, they went after universities in a much more subtle way. They didn't have to sort of throw professors in jail. They just made them irrelevant, to the general flow of society, and then converted universities into some kind of business structure, where most of the weight of the university is upon administration, um, and all the power then shifted from faculty heads and professors to the administrators and the business people running the universities. So there are many ways to sort of unplug the potential risks of that population of ages between 18 and 25, who are the most volatile and potentially dangerous to any state that's seeking to control its population. So
Well, with us, it feels as if we have thrown away what we had and we don't have anything to replace it with, and we're just in this constant state of nothingness.
join the club. The West has been like that for a long time.
And maybe the fact that it happened suddenly is what makes it so obvious here.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the difference between one day and the next for that generation that saw it all collapse must have been pretty profound.
I was about 10 years old when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a big difference.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, back to Gardens of the Moon. I think I've asked you this before, but I'm not sure if I did. I apologize. Why did you choose gestures to represent luck?
Why did I choose gestures? That's a good question. It was probably showed up in the games that the role playing games, probably quite early on. Um, Maybe as it relates to the Joker in a deck of dragons, or rather a deck of cards, where the wild card is just that. It's the one that can completely alter the outcome of a card game, um, regardless of what the other cards are. And luck has that kind of capacity to change things. Um, it just seemed, it seemed well suited, pardon the pun, to the notions of chance and random occurrence, um, and bad luck and good luck. There can be a tragic comic element to those notions, and yeah, I guess it was a good place for the trickster kind of godlike figure to be present. And also, if you think about it in Gardens of the Moon, they arrived as a kind of, they're there to just basically be shit disturbers, and they send the coin spinning. And then when Crocus picks up the coin, some of the things that happens to him are quite comedic in terms of good luck and bad luck. So I always sort of saw a sense of humor implicit in the twin gods of Opal.
It always follows them, including the way they always fail.
Yeah, yeah. And if you think of, say, Norse god Loki, the Norse trickster god, um, who messes around with sort of what the other gods are up to, especially Thor, um, but not for any particular reason, just because he's compelled to mess around with that stuff. But then when Ragnarok arrives, he is one badass dude at that point, betraying his entire family. So there's a real ambivalence to the trickster as an archetype, um, and I think Opon fits that quite well.
I was wondering, the rope possessed Sari, and Riga was there all the time. Yet Cotillion never caught her presence. How come?
If you don't look for it.
Okay. So he
Yeah.
was so sure of himself, he never even imagined there's something else there.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there's one question that usually pops up on the group. Everybody debates of what is what. I know what I make of it. What is the origin of the words soul taken and diverse, and how did you mean them? How did you come to these words?
Um, well, I had this notion of, you know, the gaming systems will often have, like, if you even if you go back to D&D, it's got your classic werewolf, um, shapeshifter, um, kind of option in the monster manual or whatever. And then it can be a were tiger, it can be, you know, various other animals. But it always seems somewhat limited in my thinking that. So I ended up trying to think, well, are there any kind of variations you can come up with to the shape shifting notion? And then I guess I stumbled on the idea of, well, would it be pretty cool if you could shapeshift into 1,000 rats, or 100,000 wasps? Uh, and so then I needed terminology that separated out the two forms of shapeshifting. But that idea of shapeshifting into a multitude of individual uh, creatures of a particular type, um, I hadn't seen anywhere before. And so there was nothing I could draw on in terms of terminology or lexicon. So I just went to the dictionary, and uh, I noticed that the word divers, uh, which is basically spelled the same as diverse, but without the E at the end of it, was an Old English um, term. And so I simply took that word, threw the apostrophe in, and came up with divers. Um, Soul taken was just basically coming up with a term that was not tied into any pre-existing earth-bound mythology. So lycanthropy was not going to work. Shape-shifting, even. I mean, I use shape-shifting, but I did want to make. I think I probably used it more earlier on, and maybe it didn't even survive the final edit, so that soul taken took over. Um, I just needed two sort of world-specific terms for these two phenomena that was not tied to here on Earth. And I guess the soul taken it's a play on SOUL taken and SOLE taken. The SOLE obviously indicating shifting to a single individual as opposed to diverse. Yeah, yeah. It's just it. One tends to sort of wander all over the place when you're trying to come up with terminology, and you go to many different sources, and unless it just sort of lands on you, sort of intuitively or instinctively. So there's always a bit of hunting around and squirreling around for something that might fit. And I mean, I never track myself doing those things. I don't take notes about it. So it's just a meandering journey until I find something that works.
Well, they do fit perfectly.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
This one is maybe a little bit philosophical. There's a scene where Whiskey Jack remembers his youth and how he ended up being a soldier, and all the despair comes back to him, and he says, despair, he told himself, always demands a direction, a focus. Find a direction and the despair goes away. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, Whiskey Jack's a character who is bound by self-control. That's the only thing that he's able to hold on to. Um, and in many respects, if you want a sort of personality or character arc for him, um, he's sort of on his last. I hate to say this. Anyways, he's on his last legs, And so, and the presence of sorry has really sort of rattled his worldview. And so he's struggling a lot with that. And of course, he's watched friends fall to the wayside as this empire continued. And so one of the defense mechanisms to sort of persist um, in under those conditions is to narrow your range of focus, and that which you can control becomes not only more important, but it becomes more singular. It becomes, like I say, a much more narrowed approach, um, which then allows you at least the illusion of control, because that's what we all exist under, is the illusion of control, and and that's what sort of helps him maintain his sanity, if you will. So.
Also about Whiskey Jack, there's a scene where he remembers finding his sword in a battle among the dead. And I was thinking about the symbolism of that, with him being Mason of High House Death, and then the the bridge burners becoming guardians of death. Was this foreshadowing, or am I just reading too much into it?
Um, that's probably reading too much into it, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the notion of the Guardians of Death sort of evolved through the writing of the series. Um, I mean, I knew he had a place there. Um, but I think probably the point for finding the sword on the battlefield was, he's in defining who he's going to become as this soldier. It seems fitting that he equips himself with the legacy of what it is to be a soldier. And so, um, if he's holding a sword that uh, previous to him holding that sword was held by somebody now dead, then that's kind of fitting to his own philosophy, his own approach to what it is to be a soldier. You seem you're literally picking up the last generation sword, aren't you? And then continuing the fight. So that's probably where my thinking was lying. Is that it's that ongoing generational perpetuation of conflict that exists in our world in various cultures. Um, so that would be the main push. And generally, what happens is, as long as you're consistent with your character and um, you're consistent with their vision of how they're going to participate in living in whatever setting you've got, um, that becomes kind of sewn in with the themes of what it is you want to be writing about. And so it's not accidental that it fits well in terms of foreshadowing. I think that's just a natural byproduct of just staying consistent with the character. So, I mean, where else could he end up but as a guardian of the dead, if you think about it? So,
Um, Dargistan. Malazan, the Malazan Empire is about to conquer them. They're basically knocking at their gates, and yet everybody is merrily getting ready to celebrate the fete of Generon, which frustrates Crocus no end. He's thinking,
mm-hmm.
what are these people doing? And that seems to be a beautiful parallel to what's going on to our own world with the whole um oh man, lost my words.
Well, it's yeah, it is. It's dance band on the Titanic, isn't it? It's yeah, yeah. It's partying like it's 1999. It's we tend to we often tend to respond to the greater the stress of everyday existence, the greater the need for simply just sort of letting loose and ignoring the reality around you and partying for the moment. It struck me as very, very consistent in kind of thinking where Darujhistan is a city that has existed in a free state for a long time for reasons that its citizens don't even understand, because they're if you read Cam's books, you find out why Darujhistan was independent for so long, and it's not necessarily a pleasant thing. So yeah, they simply can't imagine it being any different. But not only that, this is one of the things that, especially the early, like my generation teaching of history, kind of kept forgetting was when a country is conquered, when a city is occupied, for 90% of the population, life goes on as usual. It really doesn't change that much. It can be life and death for the previous rulers of the city, and military commanders or whatever. But your average peasant really doesn't notice the difference. Your average person on the street may not notice any difference. So Darujhistan's basically has been living in that idyll for a long time. So the Fete scene, yeah, of course you're going to party. It doesn't matter if they're pounding at the gates. This is just how it is.
I was actually thinking of climate change. We all know it's coming. Nobody's doing a thing about it. And I was wondering, is this just a coping mechanism? We're helpless to prevent it on our own, so we do what we can? Or is it some sort of man, doesn't matter. It's okay.
Well, it is a coping mechanism. It's also a self-defense mechanism, because one can easily despair if you become sort of too obsessed with the conditions of the world. So that's why I'm very forgiving of it. Civilization, just like any culture, acquires its own momentum. It's an internal momentum, and the individuals within that civilization, I mean, that's a tide it's very difficult to ever feel you can fight against. It just seems to be a machine that just keeps grinding onwards. We're also in an economic system that is very much a machine that's grinding onwards, and so there's that sense of capitalism is dependent upon the illusion of continuity, and the whole point about climate change is that it's basically suggesting, well, actually, that continuity may come to an end, which really is a threatening notion, because we don't know what will come from that. And so the entire system is geared towards ignoring this particular approaching disaster. And so when you're stuck in a system that is intent on pretending that everything's just fine and we can go on as we have been, what are you going to do? I mean, I mean, there are writers out there who talk about bringing down civilization in the sense of what Karsa says, and that's what I'm exploring through Karsa. But the consequences of doing so, would also spell the end to probably 95% of the human population, like the final end. So it's not a solution. But I can see why people are driven to that level of despair, that they want to bring it all down, because it's hard to imagine our civilization not bound to the capitalist ethic. Especially when you've got historical alternatives that are just as tyrannical and oppressive and brutal as the communist systems were. So you don't have sort of an example of another direction in which to go. But at the same time, you can be positive in the sense that capitalism is always looking for innovative ways of making a buck. And if there's a way in which we can convert this change of human behavior into a money-making enterprise, it will happen. And I think that's what Kim Stanley Robinson writes about a lot. If money can be made on preventing or mitigating climate change, then it will be prevented or mitigated because money is the driving force. So it's down to, you know, at what point are you going to, what are you going to reject in defense of the planet? And I think on a personal level, people are pretty resistant to rejecting, you know, their phones, their televisions, their entertainment, buying oranges in winter, you know, whatever. Yeah, we want that sort of that global access to the things that we've grown to enjoy and expect. And so there is resistance, but yeah, it's just what we are.
I was thinking that, you know, humanity also has this self-destructive nature, and I was wondering if it's just part coping with the stress of being helpless and part just irresponsible self-destroying the nature. We do that a lot.
Yeah, I don't know if we're I don't know if when I think about self-destructive behavior, I think it generally relates to um, something traumatic in that individual's life. Um, at which point, yes, it is an expression of despair, but also it's also a call for help. Um, and it's so I don't feel judgmental regarding self-destructive behavior. It strikes me um, that there are reasons for it. For each individual, there's a reason for it. I don't think it's genetically built in. So I think what happens is one can look, you know, you can look at let's see, there's on History Channel. I've never watched it because it sounds absolutely horrible, but it's a series on this independent logging company. Um, and as far as I can tell from the clips, when they're advertising the show, these people are cutting down old growth forest, and we're supposed to be sympathetic towards them because they're struggling in their business. And I probably should watch it just to inform myself, but I really cannot be sympathetic. And so then you think, well, are these people willfully being self-destructive in terms of ruining their environment? In the same fashion that people in Alaska, there was shows on people panning for gold and excavating for gold um, on the same channel, actually, History Channel. And those shows, my God, the environmental destruction of destroying, you know, a river that was probably crucial for salmon spawning just to get at the gold. And so you're looking at these people and you're thinking, are you not aware of what it is you're doing here? And I think that for me, the answer has to be, well, yes and no. You are aware of it, but your value system is such that the gold is more important than the health of the river and that whole, you know, coastline of Alaska or whatever. And there, if I'm going to place the blame on anything, it would be on our avaricious, you know, capitalist economic system. But not necessarily. You know, I'm reading right now Barry Cunliffe's book on the Scythians and nomadic tribes of Central Asia. And they were just, you know, there's a romantic notion regarding these horse tribes, but my goodness, I mean, they were slaving, they were, you know, capturing slaves from the forests, from the hunter-gatherer peoples north of them. They were obsessed with gold. Um, and they got caught up quickly in the trade systems that extended beyond, like, into the Persian Empire and with the Greeks. Um, and so it's hard to sort of maintain or hold on to that romantic notion of the freedom of the steppes and riding your horse everywhere, because it was pretty rough. It was pretty brutal stuff. So, you know, it may be that that element of human behavior is drawn upon regardless of the economic system, or rather, the economic system is um, so implicitly tied to our love of beautiful things that it's always existed in civilization. Um, with the first state, even before money arrived, you know, this desire for the aesthetic, aesthetically beautiful, is probably part of our condition. So going back to, you know, these people cutting down trees here or destroying rivers for gold, they're all imagining a better lives for themselves, and so that aspect, I mean, how can one negatively judge that, right? Isn't that what we're all seeking for in our lives? Um, and yes, I guess you have to sort of willfully, you know, block yourself from seeing the destruction by focusing on the goal. That goal being a nice house, you know, somewhere in California or whatever. So it's, I don't know. I guess I'm sort of, I'm less inclined these days to point fingers. Put it that way.
Actually, I
You know,
think
we are stuck. We are stuck in an ongoing thing, and it's pretty difficult to get out of.
you explored this nicely in Reaper's Gale. There's a scene, I think, where um oh, what's wrong with me today? Basically, there's a story about these two kingdoms, one upriver, one downriver, and there's a drought, and one of the upper kingdom puts a dam, and then the lower kingdom doesn't have water anymore. Then they go to war. They salt the land in revenge. In the end, everybody loses. So it's pretty nicely explored. The same idea.
Yeah, and those examples, you know, those are drawn from history. I think that's the Red Mask storyline, isn't it? It's connected to that. It might
No,
be
the Sheikh.
the Sheikh.
I think it's Yadan about to meet
No, you could be right.
Twilight.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, yeah, that's definitely drawn from historical accounts I've read. You know, what leads neighboring nations to war, and quite often it has to do with resources in some form or another. So, curiously, that imbalance of resources can often um, go in the opposite direction and enliven both cultures and both civilizations um, via trade. And I mean, that's what I'm reading about right now in the Cunliffe stuff. And yet there are other forces at work. In the book I'm reading on the Scythians, the climate change seems to have played a huge role in the westward migrations of these so-called hordes from the east that, you know, plunged into what is now Hungary and Romania and various other places. Um, so everybody was being pushed at some point or another, and that's happened here in North America too. Uh, Native groups were being pushed constantly by each other.
Okay, this next one might be a little tricky. We know that Uncle Mammoth has no problem whatsoever with Crocus being a thief. And there's a monologue where he thinks about it, and I'm going to quote. He says, I question rights of any kind, including ownership. Even privileges demand responsibility, as I've always said, and the privilege of ownership demands that the owner be responsible for protecting his or her claim. Now, this, of course, invites the debate of whether ownership is a privilege or a right, and how important is the difference between the two. How relevant is this concept that one is justified, or at least not criminal, in taking someone's right away if that person isn't vigilant enough to protect it? And how does it apply in today's society where people view doing the right thing as sacrosanct, morality is seen as social obligation, and the failure to behave within the parameters established by the right thing leads to social shunning or worse?
Yeah. What do you want me to say regarding that? I mean, Mamet will be rationalizing and excusing the actions of somebody who's, if not a son, is close to a son as he has. That, I mean, that's what family does, right? It builds up the rationale around the behavior of its members, or not, depending on how egregious that behavior is. I don't know if I would argue. I mean, basically, the issues Mamet's raising are just questions to think about. I don't have specific answers, but they are questions to think about.
I was wondering more along the lines of where do you stand on Mehmet's question? Do you believe that if one doesn't defend their right, then losing that right makes them somewhat responsible for it? Or
No, probably not. Those are one of those instances where I'm sort of deep into the mind of Mamet and following through his line of argument. I would have to actually have the book in front of me and read that sort of the full statement. My brain's not quick enough these days to just hear it read out as a quote and me be able to expound upon it. But it's more a case of, if it's something that's of interest to me, I will I'll do my best to explore it from as many angles as possible in the fiction I'm writing. And yeah, I'm sure Mamet was throwing out a few incendiary notions and ideas regarding property and property as theft in the Marxian sense. And then, you throw those things out there in fiction and you just let them sit there. And if somebody wants to pick that up and run with it, they're welcome to, but it's just there.
that's actually one of the things I like, that you explore a lot of ideologies, a lot of different philosophical ideas, but not all of them belong to you. So
No, not at all. But that's the thing. One has to, in order to sort of understand your own points of view, you need to challenge those points of view. And I don't mean challenging by switching the news programs that you're watching from CNN to Fox. That's not challenging anything of the sort. The challenge has to be an intellectual exercise. It has to be a personal exercise where you take your assumptions and you create a scenario in which you are planted on the opposite side of them. And then you try to argue your way back to your original position. And if you're honest and ruthless enough with yourself, your original position usually is altered by the time you get back there. And it's just, it sort of lends to a sense of self-awareness that I think these days is becoming all the more important, especially with social media being what it is. It is crucial to be absolutely aware of the implications of what you're saying online. And you can't be perfect at it. You can make mistakes and make missteps, and people can fly off the handle on the strangest things. If I were to drop in the word vegan right now, you wait till you hear the responses. So one has to be aware. And the only way you can be aware of it is if you think about it. You've got to think about it. And that's an internal process. Books may help, alternate points of view may help, but actually you should be able to arrive at those alternate points of view yourself internally. So
True. Actually, that's one of the beauties of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because we always get the other side. We
yeah.
get to see a set of characters in a particular situation. We feel for them, and then suddenly next chapter the situation is reversed, and we realize that we like the other guys too. So it's one of your gifts.
Well, I mean, it's a lot to do with forces of history and forces of civilization through time. Um, and the contrast between that and, your neighbor, um, the person walking beside you, and the individuals. In other words, you can like a lot of people, and then, that the people living, say, in a particular country, and then that country just, goes to war with you or whatever. And it doesn't mean you stop liking those people. Um, or you can disagree with what a country is doing uh, internationally in terms of, triggering coups and wars in other countries, and et cetera, et cetera. And you can deplore that, and yet have as great friends many citizens of that country. So they're two different things. I mean, forces of history and nature like that. Yeah, the buck stops somewhere, but it's probably not stopping, with that person standing in front of you. And so we have these two levels of um, empathy and sympathy and judgment. Um, and we're quite capable of keeping them very separate, which is probably a good thing, actually.
It is. I actually see that a lot happening here. There's a lot of anger against America and the political situation, and people don't seem to be able to make the difference between America as a political entity and the Americans as people. And there's a lot of hatred for Americans in general. And whenever I point out the difference, I get looked at as if I'm some sort of weird creature walking around.
Well, I mean, yeah, but the best way to get a good sense of that is to simply look around in your own culture, and is it homogeneous? Is everybody thinking the same things, believing the same things? Well, clearly not. And if that's the case in your home culture and your home civilization, you can be damn sure it's the same everywhere else. So that there is no unified entity out there uh, in the human condition. So, and I guess that's part of it in terms of the Malazan world. I'm trying to explore that notion of, um, it may appear the trappings may be different between cultures and civilizations, um, but when you get right down to human human nature, there's a lot of continuity, and there's a lot of similarity between how people feel, regardless of their circumstance. And that is it's an invitation to meeting strangers eye to eye on a level field, um, rather than simply uh, painting them in the brushes, the paints of evil, if you will, because it's just not, it's never that simple. It's never that simple. And yet, things like the military relies upon inculcating in its soldiers the notion of simplicity. The enemy is the enemy. Um, and so we do have structures in place that really dehumanize, and that's their purpose, is to dehumanize the other. And globalization, of course, is fighting in the opposite direction, ironically enough, because globalization is not great either. But at least, yeah, at least it's undermining that notion of the other, despite itself.
I don't know. It seems to be more about money and less about uniting people. It's as if
Sure.
they're using the unity as a cheap excuse to make money, and that only makes it seem fake, so people reject it.
Yeah, well, money making will always exploit, any virtue or value out there, and it will attempt to co-opt it as well. Doesn't mean that those virtues and values um, have less importance. It just means that, like anything else, they're subject to being corrupted, because that's what money does.
No,
So
I didn't mean that the values are less important, but the fact that globalization itself is cheapening those values and reducing people's trust in them.
sure, we'll do that. Yeah. But then you find out that you over here, you in Romania, distrusting this set of values, and somebody in Arkansas, United States, distrusting the same set of values. There you've created a unity without even having to go anywhere.
True. Okay, next one. Uh, Crocus and Paran, they are both tools of Opon souls, and through tools of gods, one can reach the god. We already know that. But I was wondering, mortal swords, shield amulets, vestrians, can they be considered tools of gods, and can a god be reached through them?
Probably it depends on the attitude of the god. We have an instance with Tayshrin and Banishar regarding the god Drek, for example. That was actually that god was fairly apathetic regarding its priesthood, regarding its mortal believers, until it wasn't. And so I think I tended to approach that on a individual basis, so that the potential is there to access the god via one of those characters, mortal characters, just as the potential is there to access a god via the high priest. Um, so those are just, they're a variety of sort of roles that we came up with in the Malazan world, Shield, Anvil, and Destriant, and all those. And again, it's exploring the notion of a mortal intercessor between a believer and their God, which I've always had issues with, lots of issues. So again, because it presumes almost an element of infallibility in that intercessor, which simply does not exist, because everyone is flawed in some fashion or another. None of us are perfect. Some of us work harder, I guess, at overcoming those obstacles. But I always found it presumptuous for any mortal to speak on behalf of a god, their god. So that shows up throughout the books, I think.
It does. How would you explain the difference between a mortal sword and a first sword?
First sword tended to be much more within a military structure. I think the first sword for the Amass is probably something that arose after the ritual of Talan, where the Amass became, in effect, an eternal army. And so I always viewed first sword as a military position, a rank, if you will. Mortal sword was definitely related to the gods specifically, to the pantheon and to the belief systems. So it's a religious term. Even though it's martial, it's religious. And the Malazan Empire, of course, made a point of rejecting founding their empire upon any specific god or any specific faith, which was a conscious effort, not only on Kelemed's part, although he ended up undermining that himself, but on Lacine's part, definitely a conscious effort. which is why Dasim had to be gotten rid of, because there's a spoiler for you. He had to be gotten rid of within the empire as the first sword of the empire, because he was sworn to hood a specific god. Basically, it's to avoid religious wars, or an empire founded upon a single religion, which then in that classic sort of zealous fire, spreads that faith um, into other countries, usually at the point of a weapon. And so this is something the empire wanted to avoid. So it stayed, I guess, a lot more tolerant towards a variety of religions, in the hope that each one would sort of balance each other.
This one might be a little complicated. Tool explains to Lorne that Telan is not only a source of magic, but also a place in time. That there is no parallel time than the one other than the one we know. That time is gone, it's past, and it's more an issue of flavor. He then proceeds to explain that Telan is only elder when compared to the New Warrens, but is the same flavor as Omtos Falak. And since the Barrow of Raest is Omtos Falak, this is the reason why it has never been found. So I was wondering, can you explain a little this concept of flavors? Because he clearly seems to have traveled in time to find the Barrow, yet he denies traveling in time, so it's a little confusing.
Yeah, and certainly from your description, I'm equally confused. So I'd have to go back and take a look in terms of what he's talking about in flavor. Uh, it's funny because there are certain issues I definitely deliberately made as vague as possible, and that had to do with notions of time, which I actually really, I think, I got more direct when, I guess, in Forge of Darkness I started talking about time. Um, and the notion of uh, parallel universes, if you will, which of course is more science fiction, but has a role to play in the Malazan stuff as well. So, but I wanted to keep and stay as vague as possible, because again, we're skirting on elements of the magic system, which needs to stay mysterious. So yeah, in terms of the flavors, Amtos, Falak, and Talan are kind of a counterpoint to each other. Um, but if you recall, by the end of Fall of Light, we see something of what Amtos Falak is capable of, by Hood's ritual. And we've seen elements of that. I mean, that was foreshadowed quite early on. And it's also the notion of, ice being that which can trap something frozen in time, potentially for eternity. So Amtos Falak has always been related to that. And Talan is as well, but it took it in the opposite direction. And that's why it created this undead, timeless warriors, both approaching the question of what to do about the passage of time and entropy and all the rest, and coming up with two very different answers.
There's a question that usually gets people debating, and it's about Dragnipur and when was it forged? Because Krul claims that it was forged before even his time in Gardens of the Moon, but then we know that Draconis began working on it sometime before the Theist Wars. So how does
Yeah, well, Cruel doesn't know. He doesn't know shit. And I did want to get to the point of trying to sort out when exactly Dragnipur was forged. And I think strong elements of that are going to appear in Walk in Shadow. I think the timing is right for that. Bear in mind that at this point, Cruel is in a very weakened state, anyways. And so I would not rely over much on his perceptions of what's going on at the time of the Carcanus trilogy, or his memory by the time we get to Gardens of the Moon.
Or willingness to divulge information.
That too. Everybody's cagey. Yeah.
Especially in Gardens of the Moon.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Trots, our Barghast, seems to be partially immune to sorcery, and it didn't catch my attention. But then I figured out, in Memories of Ice, we find out that the Barghast are actually part Imas and part Toblakai, and we know that the Toblakai are immune to magic. So we have Trots here also fearless, securing his tattoos and his fetishes and everything that his shaman was giving him. But I think the secret lies in his blood, actually.
Possibly.
Let's see. Uh, the scene where Anomandra kills the hounds is a pretty intense one, and then Paran notices that during the fight he got splattered with blood, which is probably what got him contaminated, not the actual touching of the hound. And as soon as the battle is over, Rake seems to see something in Paran which gets him angry, nearly kills him, and then it goes away. He says, I must have imagined it. I was wondering, what did he see? Did he see the hound inside him?
Probably. I'd have to go look, but yeah, probably.
And speaking of Paran, when he summons Opon within Dragnipur, you might say he has that ability because of being their tool, but I was wondering, isn't that more because he was becoming master of the deck? Because it seems like too much power for a tool to summon a god within Dragnipur. It's a little too
Well,
far-fetched.
it's a bit of both. But the risk that Opon takes by attaching itself to a mortal is that yes, it can mess around with that mortal's life, but it goes both ways. And so if the emotional state of that mortal is intense enough, that mortal can turn around, reach out, grab the god, and drag them into this world. So that's why it's a risky thing.
There's a point where Paran has a monologue thinking about justice and morality. And at first, he remembers how philosophers in Unta had claimed that morality was not relative, that it existed outside of the human condition. And then he thinks to himself that this idea, this concept, is just another hunt for certainty. This brings two different ideologies next to each other, and I was wondering which one you lean toward more than the other. Is morality something that exists outside the human condition, or is it something depending on society and the age that spawns it?
Um, well,
I'm aware it's not a simple yes and no question. It's quite complex.
yeah. There are elements of morality which are culture specific, and yet there are elements which are probably species specific. Um, but in both instances, it may all actually default to any being that is conscious, has self-awareness and awareness of the other, is implicitly within a moral context of some form or another. That's the only answer I'll give.
No, I remember I was fifth grade, and it was right immediately after the revolution. The communist system had fallen, and this new subject had been included in our curriculum at school, moral civic education. Now, I knew what moral is, but civic, I had no idea what that word meant. And the teacher was this old little man. He must have been in his mid 70s, quite tanned, dark skin, and had a reputation of being really mean. The first thing he does when he comes to class says test paper, and we all of us frightened. What do you mean test paper? You haven't taught us anything. And he says one single question. Out of the following three incidents, which one do you think was the worst? And bring your arguments as to why do you have this belief. One, the Holocaust. Two, the Aztecs taking out the hearts of their prisoners. And I remember thinking, really, that happened? And then the Incas using their children as messengers and throwing them on pikes to go to the gods. And all of us wrote whatever we thought was the worst and the cruelest and the nastiest. And then when we gave our papers, he just asked who said answer number one, answer number two. We just rose our hands. In the end, he said, okay, you all failed. And we were thinking, what's wrong with this man? It's so nonsensical. And he explained to us the very first thing that, wrong as it may be to us, the Nazi had their beliefs. And the Aztecs did the same. For them, it was important. Their civilization was going to crash unless they brought offerings to their gods, and the same for the Incas. And from where we stand, it seems evil. But from where they stood, it seemed right. So judging right and wrong is not as simple as absolute morality. The context changes according to time and society and how we define our notions of right and wrong. And the notions of right and wrong are not absolute. It was an important lesson.
Yeah, basically he's arguing cultural relativism, moral relativism, and my instinctive response is notions of right and wrong are actually freaking irrelevant in all three instances, the examples you gave. That there is on the outside and has to be a sense of a moral sense that steps beyond specific cultures. And I have argued this before. It's because I argued it with respect to genital mutilation.
Yeah.
That there has to be, to my mind, an overriding and overarching species spanning sense of morality. And cultures that at any specific time creates ritual behavior, and let's face it, the Holocaust was a kind of ritual behavior. In defense of an ideology, and this is the same for the Inca and the Aztecs, that is of itself heinous and dismissive of the value of an individual's life, regardless of where that person's from. Any culture that has reached that point has actually failed. And it has failed on almost every level you can imagine. Moreover, I would say, God, I can't believe you used the word moreover. Anyways, I would say that there are elements of that culture, probably profound elements that are fully aware of that failure and are exploiting it for personal gain and personal belief systems. So, yeah, I would have grabbed that old man and thrown him out the fucking window. So,
Well,
and how old were you when this was being taught?
5th grade.
5th grade.
10
That's
years old.
Yeah.
I don't know if his examples were right, but the mere questioning of morality was an important lesson.
Absolutely.
Let me think.
Absolutely. Yeah, but then to make the judgment of your choices having failed or passed is itself a moral judgment, is it not? I mean, he's telling you don't talk about right and wrong, but you take this test and you're saying this answer is right and that answer is wrong.
Well, that too, I guess. I suppose his point was that in choosing one over the other, we failed to see the bigger point. I think that was his message.
Yeah, my response would have been they're all equally, well, not equally, they're all horrendous. And if you're going to start arguing in terms of which is more horrendous, you've already, the argument
Yeah.
has already become pointless. It's become pointless because you're trying to place a particular value. Um, and how can you do that? In what position, apart from standing outside of all three of those cultures, can you attribute value and decide which is of greater value than the other? I mean, it's an absurd argument. It's an absurd position to be in. More of the case would be, if the guy had used three examples from your hometown, um, that would have been a very different story, I think.
Well, for the child that I was, the concept of moral relativism was actually the treasure there, because murder is unexcusable either way you look at it.
Yeah, yeah,
But the idea that I might not necessarily be right about what I think is right, as in they thought they were right and they failed at it. And we might be think we are right about what we do and we might be failing at it and history will judge us.
sure. But there are better approaches to it, especially for fifth graders. And I think one of the my personal experience of the most efficacious teaching method was the Socratic method. And I didn't get it in a classroom. I got it from a friend of mine who just happened to be taking philosophy at the time in university. And we would get into long arguments, and he would apply the Socratic method, and it was fantastic. To me, it's an extraordinary way of forcing upon a student or a person self-examination of their assumptions and beliefs. So So if he had taken each one of you and spent an entire class just asking you questions about why you believed what you believed, as which was the worst um, activity, that would have informed the entire class. He could have spent the whole year doing that just on the basis of that first lecture and go to each one of you. And you guys would have come out of there profoundly changed. Too bad.
Well, these were the murky, immediately post-communism times, and he was 70 back then, so
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
mentality, different generation.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh,
Interesting.
when Cole asks Paran for the truth of who he is, out in the Garobi Hills, Paran gives him to him straight. He tells him the whole truth. And Cole replies beautifully by saying, truth as bold as that deserves no less. Now, there are several things here. Do you find that most people are able to appreciate and reciprocate when they are faced with a naked, painful, and sometimes unpleasant truth, just like Cole did? Or in your experience, most people feel offended and they turn away when they're offered something so precious?
Um, I think in my experience, I tend to have already decided, having met a person after a short period of time, whether I'm going to give them something true or not. So I don't get in a situation where I'm likely to say something that offends and sends that person running or accusing or whatever. In other words, I've already made a decision of where the truth is going to go, um, and how reserved I'm going to be in the company of this person versus that person. Um, it seems safer that way. Um, I think people have to earn. Each of us has to earn uh, the veracity of others. You can't assume it, and nor make the presumption of offering it if it's not expected or asked. But that, I mean, there are countless cases that are exceptions to that. So, but in general, that's kind of the approach I take. You know, I think we all have to do that. We have to be somewhat guarded on these things because, you know, there's no way of knowing the extent to which you lay out a truth, a personal truth, and somebody exploits it. We all learn that the hard way, don't we? You know, as little kids on the playground.
I meant that more as in being the receiver of an unpleasant truth, like just like Cole was. When people tell us something that is unpleasantly but honest, at least in my experience, most people tend to turn away and feel hurt and just walk away. They
Don't you think it's specific in the instance? I mean,
yeah, actually,
is it not partly dependent upon the motivations of the person's, you know, telling that truth? What if that truth is, if the motivation is actually to hurt the other person?
yeah, that's a different context. I was thinking, you know, the same sentence could apply to the truth of everything you've poured into these books. I often felt, honestly, I often felt that you have given a lot of yourself, whether, however masked, however veiled, however, you know, in the mouths of different characters, but a lot of it is who you are, and it's quite honest, there at the reach of any stranger, and anybody can just take it and throw it against you, and that must hurt. And I always felt
Well,
I owe you the same kind of honesty instead.
right. Well, the thing is, it's fiction. Okay, so this is the delusion that an illusion that the a writer has to exercise in their minds. Um, that elements of their own life will, of course, appear in the stories they tell. There is no escaping that. But there's that once removed element. It's a work of fiction. It's not autobiography. It's not confessional. Um, Nor is it, I hope, presenting a singular um, ideological point of view. Beyond, I mean, it will get politicized. I'm aware of that. It's like Rejoice, a Knife to the Heart got politicized. I saw a comment just last week, I think, on Roxana's post. She was reading the book, and somebody said something along the lines of what did they say? Something about it's a Marxist ideology um, with the notion that the aliens are sort of providing all the um, oh man, how did it go? Well, providing I guess quick, easy solutions, and so, you know, this reader had basically dismissed the book, which is fine, except for the fact that it's not political in that sense. It's not a Marxist, you know, approach to analysis. The purpose of the aliens was not as a panacea. It's actually something triggering an existential crisis. Um, so you write things that you hope have stepped outside your own uh, whatever ideology you possess, especially if it's one that's a bit more nuanced than your average, I guess, political affiliation, which has lost all its subtlety. Political affiliations now, it's right or left, extreme right or extreme left, and there's it seems, at least in terms of how people perceive other people, there's no subtlety involved at all anymore. It's the label is slapped on, then it's slapped on, and there's a whole package of other stuff that comes with it. So when I'm looking at stuff in terms of honesty, I hold that, but specific to the human condition, not to any specific political ideology. And I think quite often those two are mixed up by readers. I don't see Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart as in any way a political or ideological, agenda-driven story. In fact, you know, writing the presidential character, the U.S. president, I actually quite enjoyed him. And this was before Trump even show up, but he was a Trump style, a bit smarter than Trump. But I actually had a lot of fun writing him, and I had great sympathy for him. And then, you know, I had a Russian president who was a stand-in for the present one, and I had great sympathy for him as well, even though, you know, historically, the present president of that country, I have very little sympathy for. But what happens with writing is you slide into the mindset of that person, and if you're honest and truthful enough to yourself, then one hopes you find something of humanity in that person. So in that sense, I do have a kind of protective measure. I can protect myself because everything in the book and series is once removed, because it is called fiction. It's in a fictional world. And where I apply as much sort of openness and honesty, it has to do with emotions and conditions of humanity, rather than any political, oversimplified kind of worldview. I have a huge aversion to that kind of simplified worldview. So I try to keep the honest stuff on that emotional, human level. And so it may appear like I'm revealing a lot, but what I'm revealing of myself, hopefully, falls under that which we all experience, as opposed to one person from a particular culture or a particular country or anything else. That these are universal emotions. And given that they're universal, well, why wouldn't you be honest and forthright with that? And it's funny because when I read clearly agenda-driven, say, military SF, I can see dishonesty in that, you know, so-called proclamation of the author's particular political point of view. It's dishonest. It's not honest. And so I have a huge aversion to that.
It's particularly this honesty with regards to emotion and human condition that I was actually referring to, because most people tend to be cagey about these things. They are personal, they're intimate. People avoid talking about what they feel. I don't know if it's cultural, just on our side of the world, or if anyway, you revealed a lot of the way you feel, and few people have the courage to do that.
I don't see it as courage. It was more, how can I reach those places in the reader if I don't expose those places myself, right? How could I presume to actually trigger any kind of emotional response in a reader unless I've experienced and am experiencing those emotional responses? To me, I mean, the most effective novels and film and television I've ever watched are the ones that are able to reach through and trigger and get past my defenses. That is the kind of stuff that I just absolutely adored and still do. And so when I'm producing art, I want to try to achieve the same kind of thing. I want to get past those defenses. it seems these days those defenses are kind of confused, because if somebody perceives something as from a political point of view, then the rest of the package gets blocked as well, and you can't get through, which is very unfortunate, but that's sort of how we are right now. But I still have faith that anybody can be reached. There's just probably different ways of doing it, and some of those ways may be well beyond my capability, but I still hold on to the faith.
Actually, now that you pointed out that some certain emotions can be politicized,
Mm.
that's something I see a lot in US and Canada, but it doesn't happen so much here, nor this, you know, this limitation in choices, either left or right. We are not that much politically oriented, which is also a flaw, come to think about it. I think only 27% of the electorate show up for elections this year, so that shows.
Um, if only 27% are showing up, the failure lies with the state, not
Definitely.
with those people. What it means is, on a general day-to-day basis, in terms of the value system of those, um, I don't know, what was it, 73% that don't vote or whatever, are not in any way addressed by the political system as it presently stands, which means those needs are not being served. And that value system is not being served. And so unplugging and being indifferent to it, you may not like it, but it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense.
It has bad political consequences for all of us.
Of course it does, because it
But
allows, yeah, absolute freaking idiots to be in charge. And they're all self-serving. They're all there to line their own pockets, by and large. And those who aren't tend not to be as effective playing that game of power as those who are.
and
So
there's
it's
nothing.
kind of an unfortunate situation. Yeah.
Do people often confess to you painful or private stories from their lives as a response to the insights on human nature and pain and trauma that you explore in the books?
Yes.
One confusing issue is the lifespan of the Taist. I mean, Anomander says they live between 15,000 and 20,000 years, but we know that the Adur have a lifespan of 400 years, yet they are the same species. So that always creates a lot of debate on the group.
All right. Apologies to all those people debating that, because I haven't a clue. I mean,
Okay.
it's one of those things where I probably made something up because it suited the moment in that scene, promptly forgot it, and then made something else up later. So
There is one of Icarium's clock's devices in Daruchistan, and on it are engraved the names of each and every year for a very long time. And the year we find ourselves in is curiously named the Moon's Tears. Did you know by the time you were writing Gardens of the Moon that you would sink Moonspawn?
yeah, yeah. Not just sink it, but it's the ending of Memories of Ice and Corlat. Yeah.
This one is probably shooting a blank bullet, but I have to try. Raya's mother was the first one to deny him and proclaim the sundering of blood. Will we ever know who she was? I mean, I know
Whose
I
mother?
asked
I'm
you,
sorry. Whose mother?
Reyes,
Riest.
Reyes, okay. Because I know I asked you
No, I don't
about
think we'll ever know.
I
No,
asked
we
you
won't
about
ever know.
Icarium's mother once, and your answer was that if it ever becomes important to the story, we'll know, otherwise probably not.
Yeah.
I still had to ask. Okay, during her fight with Riest, Silana uses both Starhold Emelaine and Kural Galain So I was wondering why Coral Galen, did Anomander have the power to let her use the magic of his people, or is it due to the similarity between the two elements?
Well, I think a lot of that was already pointed to or alluded to in Fall of Light, that there is a draconian genetic legacy within the Taistandi already. So yeah.
Okay. So they have the power to use darkness because of their draconic nature, not the other way around.
Well, to a certain extent, but also it's a relationship between darkness and chaos as well. Um, that they're in, they are bound to one another.
Okay, that's nice. That's a good reveal. This one was a little confusing for me. When Lorne enters the tomb of Riest, she has no idea about the finesse. Tool explains to her what it is. So clearly Lassine told her nothing. Whether she knew or didn't know, we don't know about that. Yet, after she identifies the finesse, she knows exactly where to go and drop it in Darujhistan. So was that something that Tool told her, or and there's another thing to it, is that one soldier tells Whiskey Jack that the garden estate has been wild of late, which seems to hint that the Azat was already there, but maybe too young for the local powers to have taken notice of it. So how did Lorne know where to throw that acorn?
I think she's basically wants to do it in the noble district and needs to find um, obviously ground not built on, so raw soil. Um, it's more a question of wherever she puts it, all that other stuff was going to arise. Um, so it's not a question of her knowing specifically where to put it. It's just where she put it is where the house grows up, and that triggers all these other things. So that's kind of what I meant, I think.
So convergence, power draws power, oppon's influence, all come into the same place.
Yeah.
Um, we get to meet briefly a mage of the Crimson Guard, Fingers, and he's described as being very thin. And then in the Return of the Crimson Guard, over and over and over, he is described as being thin, and I think that's foreshadowing to what's going to happen. So actually, what is already happening to the Crimson Guard. So is this something that you were foreshadowing on, or just one of those instances where Cameron caught on something and worked on his own?
Yeah, he worked on his own. Where he took the Crimson Guard, uh, that was great. I mean, and that happened in the novels, and that blew my mind. That was really cool. And I guess you'd have to ask Cam, but he may well have been planning that all along. Um, Fingers was a character I wrote up for a game. My characters were Fingers, Blues, and Skinner, and then briefly Jork Sharplance, but that was mostly for comedic purposes. He was the character I overplayed in the sense of his bombastic self-certainty. So we didn't get to see him much, George Sharplance, but I mean, even the name was comical. Uh, but Fingers and Blues were my two primary characters that I played when Cam was running the Crimson Guard campaigns. And yeah, he was skinny, um, in the habit of, I think he'd acquired a permanent flight spell, so his legs atrophied because he used to just sort of float like 3 feet above the floor with his legs crossed. So Cam had to sort of alter a few things on Fingers. Um, but yeah, it's a good chance Cam was setting that up very early on. Yeah.
Um, right at the end, Orfantal reminds Corlat, when they're discussing whether to destroy this new house of Azad or not, that it was Mother Dark's hope in the innocence of light that led to the destruction of their world, to which Corlat counters that hope is a flaw to be cherished. And this again sets two different ideologies in opposition. So, what do you personally believe? Is hope a flaw and are all flaws a bad thing?
No, all flaws are not bad things. No, absolutely not. Um, uh, I can't think of any artist in terms of biography, autobiography, or the works they produce who are clearly and were clearly not in some way deeply flawed. And I think that is actually almost where creativity finds the most fertile ground. Um, Not always for good. You know, I like reading autobiographies of uh, musicians, and I remember reading Chrissy Hines and from the Pretenders. Um, and you want to talk about an honest storyteller, and that I mean that's an impressive book. Um, Same for Bruce Springsteen's autobiography. Um, it's not a question of celebrating flaws. It's more a case of acknowledging um, that there are things that get past our defenses, and that we have to deal with on a daily basis, whatever flaws we possess. Um, and that is the element that humanizes us. Otherwise, we'd all be AI robots. We're not. So um, it would seem churlish not to celebrate our imperfections, if you will, at least to my mind.
Um, there's this series of books that is really amazing. And I think I saw you comment once that you have never read them. It's called The Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I was wondering why you never read your own books.
Um, I had to go back and reread Forge of Darkness, and I'm just finishing up Fall of Light in order to take notes and remind myself and get back into the voice and style. Um, the times I've had to do that, this sounds weird and it probably sounds arrogant, but it isn't. Um, I'm intimidated. And sometimes I feel quite often that whoever that version of me was writing those books um, ended up comparatively being a far better writer than I am now. And so that is why um, I'm reluctant to go back to the books, because it actually undermines my confidence, my present day confidence, and I'd rather not do that. So
Oh,
because I need to keep writing.
that's quite an honest admission. Thank you. Uh, One last topic. It's gonna be probably several questions. Recently, I got to find out with a lot of surprise that the Malazan community is considered to be toxic by the other fantasy fandoms. And I was really surprised because I tried it for a while. I joined this fantasy faction, whatever long name, page name book, Facebook group, and I was on my absolute best behavior. And still, I got accused of having a case of superiority complex and being arrogant. And I was completely taken aback. I remember I asked the guy why. Why did he say all these things? And apparently, just a simple thing as saying the books are complex and complicated makes you toxic. I was,
Yeah.
I didn't know how to deal with it. Basically, what I'm asking here is whether we like it or not, we the fans are ambassadors of the series, and the way they say, like father, like son, like author, like fandom, and sometimes I feel that what we do affects your reputation as a writer, as an author, whether we like it or not. It is the way it is.
Hmm.
So I was wondering if that, in parallel with a different question that one other fan asked me to convey, what do you think about this renewal of the series and the new interest, which probably is fan driven, and our infiltration, so to say, of other fantasy pages and promoting. And so on one side we're doing all this job out of passion, and the series sees a renewal, but on the other side we seem to be damaging its reputation by being so toxic. So
No, 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 no. Bear in mind that that's one person throwing out, you know, these passive aggressive
there
bullshit
are
phrases
several.
about toxicity, um, without ever recognizing that their very observation about somebody else being toxic is itself toxic. And so, it's, you can't, don't let it get under your skin. You can't let it. Um, it would drive you mad because a lot of these comments are just, they're just thrown out there. I mean, there's no real uh, reason thinking behind them. They're thrown out, I guess, in an effort to wound whoever that person is. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it about that person's life that makes it um, desirable to lash out and hurt somebody else? And there may be a lot of things going on in that person's life that actually, if you knew it, you would go, oh, I get it now. It doesn't mean that what they're doing is justifiable, defensible in any sense, but the context may be that those who lash out the most are the ones hurting the most. Um, but to get involved in any kind of back and forth with them is probably not worth your effort.
No, that's why actually I've unfollowed the page. I was afraid I might not be able to hold on to myself. There's only so much I can keep quiet when people insult you or your work. I
Sure,
just
same here.
squeeze.
Sure.
I squeeze my teeth. I walk away, but once, twice, thrice, and then I thought either I completely walk away or I'll end up being a toxic fan, really for real. So
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that's the whole thing, is that I don't know, there's only so much people can take, and that includes everybody. Um, and so if it's your habit to actually lash out at others, or accuse others, or proclaim that others are being toxic, or blah 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 blah, then basically, to me anyways, you're simply signposting your own toxicity, um, and it's not really going to get you anywhere. You may feel satisfied for a few minutes, but it's not going to get you anywhere. Um, and that's the saddest thing. It's such a waste. Um, I suppose I could be going online and um, ranting about Star Trek Discovery. Um, but even if I do so, I'll try not to make it personal. I'm talking about this particular work and the flaws that I perceive in it, and then I would argue and try to basically describe why I see them as flaws. So there, I'm putting together an argument. It may be emotional, it may be heated, but I'm still attempting to put together a reasoned argument for my position. Um, Conversely, you know, one can go online and just hate all the main actors, or the characters, or the writing room, or whatever, and you've just wasted, an hour writing up this rant, or going in front of a camera. doesn't get you anywhere. You know, the rants on Star Wars or whatever. What's it doing? It's not doing anything. If it's doing anything, it's having a negative effect on the creative side of the entertainment industry. So it just seems to be so self-destructive in that respect, but unconsciously so, which is too bad. It's that toxicity I mean, it's not exclusive to the Malazan. This is what I've noticed anyways. It's out there. Almost anybody's creative effort that's gone into the public eye will have either amongst its fandom or its hatedom a toxic element. And what can you do? It seems to be thriving in this particular environment.
Well, from my experience with other fandoms, we are probably the most civilized and well-behaved, but maybe that's just me being biased. I don't know. I'm not the only one who shares this opinion, but then we are all
Yeah.
fans of Malazan, so maybe we are all being biased.
And of course, it just takes one person, to go in the opposite direction, and suddenly you have 10 people who are now feeling um, are now the subject of passive aggression from that one person. So that one person is now, disturb the well-being of 10 other people. For what? What was the point of that? But I have no answers to that. Those impulses that drive people. Oh well.
Well, that concludes the last set of questions for Gardens of the Moon.
Alrighty. Yeah, I think we've got a nice warm day out for a change. So probably go for a walk.
We have snow.
Wow.
It's
Lots?
rare. I think it's the third day of snow we have had this season, and by snow I mean 1 centimeter of snow on tree branches and squelch on the streets. But it's snow.
Wow. Is that typical, or is
It's
is the
it's typical.
level of snowing in your winters going down?
It's going down, but in
Yeah.
Timisoara it's always been less. We are in the middle of a flat plain, and we've always had little snow.
Yeah.
But there used to be more when I was a child.
Yeah. Yeah. Winnipeg's the same thing. Winnipeg, you could skate outside, I'd say from middle of December all the way through until end of March. And now the skating rinks are very difficult to maintain for those intervening weeks, because you get these sudden warm spells that just rot the ice, and then you're having to sort of do it all over again. Yeah, climate change.
Well, this was fun. Dead House Gaze is probably going to take me at least another 3 weeks, so you won't be hearing from me for a while. Good news is that I have less questions than I had for Gardens of the Moon, so.
Cool. Okay. Well, it seems that we often get off in other subjects and talk about other things anyways. So that makes it always, I find that more interesting than just a list of questions. So, because what it means is we're having a conversation as opposed to anything else, which is cool.
I always saw the deeper points of the series quite clearly, at least I think I did. So the only mystery that's left is in the things that I don't know. And I know some of them you don't want us to know, but at least I'd like to know how you meant them, because as I said, authorial intent, what we understand, we are free to take it however we want.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to know how you meant them, what you wanted to convey.
Yeah. Cool. No problem.
All right then. Wish you a beautiful sunny day, beautiful walk.
Thank you. Yes. And I guess it's evening for you, right?
Yeah, it's 12:20 a.m.
Good grief. All right. Well, get some sleep.
I'm a night owl anyway. I'm probably not going to go to sleep until 2 a.m. tonight, so that's fine.
Wow. All right. Well, Have a nice cup of tea and wind down.
All right, thank you.
Take care.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.